Hello, everybody. My name is Rick Lewis. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Ohio School Boards Association, and I want to welcome all of you to our town hall meeting for this week. I also want to say thank you. I know that your plates are busy. I know that there's a ton of things to do, and it's important to us that you were able to take time today and be part of this critical conversation. The issues that we're going to be tackling today are complex, probably unnecessarily complex, but they are. But however, having said that, they're all very critical to moving our students forward and to making our society actually a better place to live as well. I want everybody to know here that OSBA is just not jumping on a bandwagon. I think in conversation with Jeff Chambers earlier today, he put it well that we've been trying to pull the wagon for a number of years. I think many of you have recently seen the statement that OSBA put out regarding race relations, and it's something our entire Board of Trustees believes very firmly in. And if you haven't seen it, I won't read that to you at all today, but I know the link will be put up so you can go back to that. But we're not new to this game. I want to go back a decade and in 2010 talk about when OSBA first started participating in this type of work. We partnered with Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, and a program called Diversity Plus Respect Equals Inclusion. And in the following year, we actually came up with our own internal diversity and inclusion committee. And this goes back, like I said, 10 years with Janice Smith, who was our CFO at the time, and Lenore Winfrey were founding members of that team. We tried to concentrate on staff training, policy, and start rolling out some membership issues. And then we doubled down even in 2017 when we unveiled our diversity and equity team, which is a forum that school board members would be able to talk about the critical issues facing public education. And through the entire work, we've had the support of our Caucus of Black School Board members. But in spite of all the work we've done over the last 10 years, we also get, the fact that I think it was President Johnson during the Civil Rights Movement said, there comes a time where good leaders have to put all their chips in. And I think that's where we find ourselves right now. So we're stepping up the awareness with our staff. I think what you'll notice differently this week is every member of the OSBA staff, just not the leadership team, but every member of the OSBA staff is participating in this call today as a chance for us to learn and grow as well. We're making more resources available. We're trying to make more services available than ever before to our members. And I just got off a phone call with the executive directors of New Jersey, Illinois, North Carolina, Missouri, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And each of those other 7 states have made a commitment that we are going to work together to do some programming between all of our school boards. So you're going to see, I think in the coming weeks, you'll learn more about it. We're still in the infancy stages, still in the discussion stages, but there's going to be a lot of neat work coming forward where you're going to be able to take advantage of the resources of all of those large states. And I think we're going to make some pretty special things happen. And in the end, because we owe it to our students, we want to listen, we want to understand, and we want to help. And this is our way of starting that. And that brings us to tonight. So I know Kathy and her team have put together an awesome program for some of the best thinkers and the most knowledgeable experts in the field. I'll get out of the way and turn it over to Kathy Mark to explain what's next.
Thanks, Rick. And hello, everybody, and welcome to such a great time we're going to spend. And I want to get going right away, but I want to reach out to my good buddy and ask Mark how he's doing.
Evening, Kathy. I had to take a sip of water, so sorry about that. How are you?
I'm good. I mean, I know we've talked like 14 times today, but it's showtime, so
total
going well.
Yeah.
So, some exciting about tonight. We've gotten so many great questions that, and some really difficult questions that people want us to throw to our experts. So we're going to do that. I do want to remind everybody this is being recorded, not only this section of it, but also the chat box. So that is going to be available to everyone. And I'm just excited that we're going to have some good conversation and some good solution-based takeaways at the end. Mark?
Yeah, this is, as I've said, this is a tremendous time. And using that term, meaning that there's a lot of things converging at the same moment. Mm-hmm. And I think it's tremendous in that we have an opportunity to be better on the other side of this. So I'm excited about tonight's conversation. I'm excited about the possibilities that will be born from tonight's conversation, because I do believe what we'll receive tonight will begin to help with the change in the areas in which we're able to have impact on. So this is going to be exciting tonight. Really quickly, because we do want to hear from our experts, I just want to remind us Just the rules of the game. Tonight we have the chat box open, and we want to make sure that we hear the questions from you. We've got some questions here, but we want to make this interactive. So we'd like for you to go to the chat box to the right. If you have a question for tonight's panel, Kathy and I are going to do our best to monitor that. And I don't want to make any false promises. We're going to do everything we can to address the questions that are in the chat box, and also the questions that were sent out into us. So please feel free to put your question in the chat box. We'll make sure we get that over to our panelists tonight.
Yeah,
Kathy?
I think, Mark, it's important for everyone to know we're going to devote the entire town hall this evening to our panelists. So we will not be having a legal and a legislative update. We'll make sure we catch everybody up next week in those two areas. But at any time, if you have questions for anyone on our team, please make sure you reach out to OSBA. All right, Mark, let's get us out of the gate here.
All right. And again, tonight we're excited to have some experts here to help us have the discussion about race relations in the schoolhouse and how it's best to approach it, how to have those conversations. And what tonight we want to do is to begin to, I think, take away a little bit of the anxiety around the topic for us. We want to learn how to have these honest, real discussions in the places of influence. So tonight, we have panelists here with us tonight that are going to give us some great information. At this time, I want to ask Dr. Amisha Barrett, start us off with the intro, and then we'll go down the line.
All right, thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you everyone who has dialed in. I am honored and humbled to be part of the conversation. My name is Dr. Amisha Barrett. You can probably see it on the screen because I'm talking. And I am a 30-plus year educator who has devoted the vast majority of my work to working with culturally and linguistically diverse learners who are often underrepresented in our school systems. And they're also the first children who we identify or label with something that says that they are deficient or deficit. So as I began to work with schools and districts and district leadership, not only educators, but school board members, I've always worked to elevate the awareness around culture that's required in order to raise achievement for our learners. So that's the focus of my consulting business, is really understanding how understanding diversity and equity of the children and the culture that they bring to school, the culture of your schools, can really shift move the needle, so to speak, on the things that you're concerned about most. And that should be equitable instruction and academic achievement for every child that's in your school.
Dale Johnson.
I too am privileged to talk with you this afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. I am Vice President of Business Development for a company called Orgometrics. We have two tools that we use, both to leverage data. So Orgometrics measures the degree to which employees buy into the strategic plan, because obviously what we know is the more aligned employees are, the more the metrics that matter to you increase. And also we have a tool called Equimetrics, which measures the degree of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Does the same thing, allows you to leverage data to drive the metrics that matter. I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Daniel Jude, excuse me.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Like others have already said, it's a real honor to be here. I don't take it lightly that I get to be included in conversations with people who are leading organizations and trying to make those organizations better places to live, learn, and play for everybody. And I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon. And a lot of my work and the way that I do it centers around or has kind of a human-centric focus, working to reframe and unpack some of the conversation in the conversations that I have with business and school leaders. A lot of the challenges are really initial speed bump type challenges. How do we get into this conversation? How do we think about it? You know, many of the teachers in our building, you know, think that diversity means this, and half of them think that it means that. And how do we unpack this conversation and get everybody on board this train so that we can actually go somewhere? So I do a lot of work in reframing the conversation, teaching shared vocabulary, shared values, and shared vision around what it is that we're trying to get accomplished. And so I think I'm good at doing that, and I think I'm not as good at doing some of the other things that some of these other folks are really good at doing. So I'll let them speak to what they're good at, and I'll try to chime in as I feel like I've got something to say. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Daniel. Steve Francis, excuse me.
Thanks, Mark and Kathy. And Welcome, everybody. My name is Steve Francis. I'm president of Franchise D&I Solutions, which is a diversity and inclusion strategy consulting firm. We believe that everything begins and ends with strategy. People don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. And we make sure that you don't shoot before you aim. We believe that also emotion is the enemy of intelligence. And what you've been seeing is a lot of emotion in the protests, but you haven't been seeing enough of the sitting down at the table and strategizing on how to truly and address in a meaningful way institutional and systemic racism in our society. I've been asked to, my phone's been ringing quite a bit recently due to the George Floyd and et al. Racial situations. My experience spans over 35 years of doing some sort of diversity work, whether it's supplier diversity as I began my career, or heading up diversity for Honda, and heading up diversity for the city of Columbus, and now doing a variety of consulting for clients in a lot of sectors, public and private. So I'm hoping that I can add to the conversation. I'd like to have you reflect on 4 questions as we engage in discussion today, in addition to all the other questions. How do you feel? What do you need? What is your hope for the future? And what are your what is your expectation for meaningful change related to racial justice, racial relations? What does that really look like? So those are the 4 things that I would like to have as a backdrop as we have a discussion tonight.
Thank you, Steve. And Rico Rice.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rico Rice. I'm the president of Redcon. We're a organizational development firm based in Cincinnati, Ohio. We provide coaching, strategic planning, and training, both face-to-face as well as a virtual training platform in the areas of diversity and inclusion, community and talent engagement, and customized learning solutions. Prior to starting my company 11 years ago, I was a school counselor here in Cincinnati, and my work in diversity was born out of my work as a school counselor. Oftentimes I would get referrals to students from teachers, and they would be addressed as behavior problems. But after quick conversations, I was able to detect that it was not as much as a behavior problems as it was a cultural disconnect. So over the last 11 years, I've been working with schools and organizations, police departments, nonprofits, to bridge that cultural disconnect, both through training, action planning, and just having authentic conversations. So I look forward to the conversation today, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you to each of our panelists. And just a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to ask everybody to make sure their phones, computers, what have you, are on mute. Also going to ask each of our panelists at this time if you can quickly put your contact information in the chat box so everybody will know how to get in contact with you. They might want to have further conversation with you after today's discussion. But let's jump right in. Dale Johnson, in your own words and experiences, how would you define race relations?
You know, that's a great question, Mark. Thanks for asking me that. And what I would say is, it's the way in which people of all colors interact overtly and covertly, and understand and see through the lens of those not like them, and adjust their behavior, attitude, mindset, and heart.
So when you say the adjustment, talk more about the adjustment.
You know, I'm in the workplace, and, you know, I see some people not like me. Am I willing to adjust my approaches? Am I willing to adjust my expectations, or what maybe I may have heard about this particular culture is, and look at them for who they are, and not potentially what I may have thought they might be or what I may have seen.
All right. And I'm Dr. Berry, your thoughts on race relations.
I'm going to preface this with, I was born and raised in California. In my block, from the time I was a small child, we were a universe of people from around the world. My neighbors were Latino, they were Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Black, white, Okie, specifically those whose families had migrated from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. I grew up just seeing that there was one race and that was human. So it has been in my work and traveling around the United States as an adult that I really began to understand that there were more conflicts that were occurring because of the color of people's skin. So I've always felt, there's one race, it's human. And where we have conflicts, it seems to be that because we are in a community or a world where we've been steeped in this systemic bias based on our skin color. And so my focus has always been on diversity, primarily cultural diversity, and how do we get to understand each other's cultures so that we can really understand the people who live in that skin. I think once we get to that point where we understand that, really our primary differences are about our cultures, it's in our systems of belief. And if we can be tolerant enough to understand each other's belief systems and to overcome some of the ignorance that we all have about other cultures, that's when we can start to foster true change.
So Rico, in hearing that, what comes to mind, even in the current discourse on race? What are we missing right now? I mean, everybody's talking about it, but what are we missing in the discourse right now when it comes to race relations?
I think it goes back to something that Steve hinted on a little bit ago, just the strategy, right? And I understand that there's phases to it, right? And the protest and the civil unrest is great for conversation and the releasing of statements from the organizations. But I think what's more important and what's gonna carry on, because as we know, the conversation switched, right? If this was 3 weeks ago, this whole conversation would have probably been about COVID, and in another 2 or 3 weeks is going to be about something else. So really, the real work begins with the strategy. What are we doing? How are we going to take these conversations to implement change? How are we going to create policies? How are we going to create programs? How are we going to change our practices to really be equitable? How are we going to listen to those individuals and who are going to have the ability to affect those changes, right? Or is it going to be the same people that have set out the policies before that has created some of this divide and inequity, or are we going to invite others to the decision-making process and really take in their thoughts and their considerations and change our perspective? I think there's been a lot of conversation about, okay, we're going to bring these folks at the table, but I was working with a board yesterday and they were talking about bringing in more diverse talent, but that's great, but are you going to give them the voice, and are you going to take those thoughts and perspectives and embed it into what you're doing? So that's what we have to really focus on now, not as much of the releasing statements and doing those things, but actually putting together those programs, putting together, reevaluating our policies, and having informed discussions from individuals that are both affected by it and also have the expertise to help drive that change.
So Steve, when Rico mentions that bringing voices to the table, and you talked about your experience working in the city of Columbus and doing this type of work, can you talk about the importance of having those voices at the table, but actually validating the voice? It's one thing for me to be at that table and I speak my piece, but when I leave the table and what I've said, I don't see it manifested. How do you validate the voice to make it an integral part of the strategy going forward?
That's a great question, and it's a great point. I have told groups that I have facilitated, it's not enough to have a seat at the table. You have to have a voice at the table, and it's not enough to have the voice at the table. You have to have your voice heard. Some people describe their organization as needing a megaphone to be heard, even though you're sitting at the table. And so I try to get into the culture of the organization to determine whether it is an environment that encourages psychological safety. And the concept of psychological safety is you can be yourself, raise questions, raise concerns, raise problems, disagree. You have your freedom to provide your valuable input from your diverse perspective. So those are important things that speaks to the culture of the organization. Is there psychological safety within the organization? I'll give you a short example. The NASA, I think it was the Challenger that exploded tragically. We all know that there was an engineer who knew that those seals would not hold and that there was going to be a huge catastrophe. But there was not psychological safety within NASA for him to feel like he could speak up to the powers that be and express that problem, which could have saved, you know, how many lives? I don't know, 8 or 9, and trillions of dollars worth of technology and assets of the NASA organization. So that's a prime example of not having psychological safety and the cost of not having your voice heard or not feeling like you would have your voice heard when a critical situation arises that you can add value to.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm going to come to you, Daniel, because Steve talks about the psychological safety, and Rico started us out by saying that voice at the table. Daniel, so a question that comes up is, well, who should really be having these conversations? Sometimes there's this thinking that the conversation is only important if it's coming from certain places. Kind of deconstruct that a little bit for me. Who should really be having these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I guess everybody to a certain extent, right? Because it's our world and we all get to create the world that we want to live in, or get to be a part of creating the spaces that we want to inhabit. But I think, you know, I think part of the narrative that needs disrupted is, you know, and I don't hear a lot. I don't hear this a lot, but it does come up. You know, this is kind of a black problem, or this is a fill in the blank, marginalized or oppressed people's problem. To me, a problem is a symptom of something else, right? And so I think primarily of two groups when I think who should be having the conversation. Number one, it's white people. We own this problem, both statistically, I think, just in terms of numbers, you know, of population and who gets to sort of have their voice heard a lot, and historically, as we just seek to correct deep and long-standing injustices in our country's history. We don't get to ignore those just because I wasn't personally there when they happened. I still get to acknowledge and be aware of how history played out, and to understand my role as it relates to race relations and working some of those things out. The other group I think that needs to be having this conversation, and there's a lot of crossover here to the white community, but those in power. And I think that's part of the verbiage that's maybe missing from the D&I conversation a lot of the times is power. It's really a question of interrogating structures of power and asking who's in control, who has power, how do they get it, and what does it look like? Who doesn't have power and why not? And what does it look like in this space when someone doesn't have power? That goes for everything from, you know, a specific classroom and working with a teacher through that conversation, to the school building, to the district, to the city in which that district lives, and beyond. So I guess short answer is white people slash those in power, but there's a lot of intersection in those two groups.
So thanks, Daniel. I guess, and then this is my kind of, I want to grab something and take away. I understand that piece, but what does that look like? What does it look like when somebody who's in power is actually doing the work that you're talking about? Like, what's one thing you can share with us that says, listen, when you are sitting in a superintendent position or a principal position or a teacher position, I see Dr. Berry's got her hand up. What is something that we can do of these people that you've identified as powers to be that can make sure that people know that their voices are being heard? And Daniel, I asked you first, and then I'll pass the ball over to Dr. Berry.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the most important things that leaders or people in visible positions of power can do is get corrected publicly and accept the correction and grow and learn. Don't get defensive. Don't play it off. Don't pass the buck. One of the most important models that leaders get to do is to demonstrate what learning as leaders look like. And so that would be my short answer. And I think there's a lot going on there. but model learning, listening and learning.
Yeah.
But I'm actually super interested in what Dr. Berry has to say. So I want to pass it over to her.
Yeah, and before we go to her, I will say it is really hard to own it, isn't it? When you make a mistake, or when you make a mistake, and it is hard to own it and grow in that space. So I thank you for recognizing that, because I think there are a lot of people that struggle with that. Dr. Berry.
Okay, staying in my lane, which is about what happens in our classrooms. And I agree with everything that's been said about who has to have the conversation. But I think the biggest miss when we look at the people that are on this call and what they can do to create change is that in your schools, I'm going to venture a guess, I'm going to keep a conservative estimate and say that 99% of the school systems that are on this call do not tell a true and complete story of the country's biggest thing, which is slavery, and why we're even having this conversation today, why our country looks the way it does. 400 years of government-sponsored physical, social, and economic oppression. And in our school systems, we look at slavery and the origins of this country for about 2 weeks in 2 years of a child's K-12 education. So if we want to change the way our children see the world when they become adults, if we want to have some really deep understanding of why we're in the position that we're in, we need to start looking at what we're teaching in our classrooms. I actually do a workshop that's called Where's My History, where we actually evaluate district curriculum based on a culturally relevant framework. But like I said, there are, in fact, I believe there's only one state, and my home state here in Texas, where social sciences framework does demand that schools teach Latino studies and Black studies for more than 2 weeks for 2 years of a child's K-12 education. We have to have that understanding. Our children need that instruction if they're to grow and become adults who can have those conversations without being afraid of having them. And I'll wrap by saying, we all look at Germany as being one of the countries that had the most horrific oppression of peoples in World War II. But the reason the Germans were in the streets a couple of weeks ago telling us that we were oppressive is because they teach how ugly Nazism was. They don't have Nazis in Germany, but we have Nazis here in the US. And I think we need to start questioning why we allow those things to happen here. And if we want that change, we can start it in our classrooms, starting in kindergarten.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. Dell, you ready? I want to bring this one to you. This is from one of our members. Why do you think the aftermath of the current protest will be different than previous protests throughout American history? Why is it different this time, do you think?
Well, interesting enough, I'm born and raised in Minneapolis, and that's where our business is. So obviously I experienced George Floyd and what happened firsthand. And I have never in my life seen something as epic as what went on. I drove through the neighborhood. I live about 25 minutes from where that happened, and the buildings that were all burnt down. But the way the community came together, and we've come together before, but the way the community came together this time seemed to be a lot different. And you felt the shock waves across the country and across the globe, which gave a different feel. So to me, that's what spoke to some of the main difference. I think it's some of the younger generation that got involved and showed their leadership skills. I just hope that they don't get tired and realize that this is a marathon and not a sprint. Myself personally, I've dedicated my life to obviously helping out those that look like me. I've mentored kids, I've done leadership, I've done career counseling for a good portion of my life in trying to do that. So I've worked with underrepresented students and trying to help them be better. So I felt the pain. I've seen the pain. I've experienced some from loved ones and this, that, and the other. So again, back to why I think this is going to be different is because of the level of connectedness, the level of seriousness, the level of feeling of tiredness, that this is just all permeated to all levels. And they said, enough is enough. We want this to change. We're not going to give this up. And I think that's what's allowed this to manifest.
Thank you. Rico, I see that you put something in the chat box. Do you want to speak to what you've put in the chat box?
Well, I put a couple things in there. One was responding to Donna Frio about recruitment of, I think the question was 90% of college graduates are white. So what do we do as far as recruitment? And I responded to her or him or her, just saying that I think it starts with the student experience, right? We don't go places, we don't go places often that we don't have a positive experience, right? So if you think about a lot of times with engagement, if you want to recruit or we want to build more educators of color, the first thing we need to do is make sure that as students, individuals of color have a positive experience, and that goes from equal treatment as far as discipline to showing them in curriculum and just making sure that their experience is one of that is engaged. The second part of it is also thinking about how do we think about the education profession as a teaching profession. You know, oftentimes it's taught as a lifelong career. So maybe spending some time thinking about do we look at it as a 5 to 10 year career, allow individuals to have some time as teachers and then move on to other careers? Because one of the things that we see is that there's a high burnout rate for teachers. So really framing the conversation about that. The second piece was some books. I think Cheryl Ryan had asked what are some books, and one of the books that I know that has gotten a lot of attention, especially for white people as it relates to race relations, is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So I just wanted to share that resource as well.
Thank you, Rico.
Yeah.
Steve, I want to come over to you really quickly. How is this going to be different?
Well, I think, well, let me just touch base on a couple things that were discussed. I believe that as leaders in the school systems, we have an obligation to not just ask the questions, but to also question the answers. And that could be answers from our faculty and staff, our administrators. We have to question, you know, we can't just accept the answer, that's the way we've always done it, because that could be a very flawed and broken model. On books, I was speaking to Dublin, one of the high schools last night, and a bunch of the Black parents of students. And I asked them what about their curriculum, right? I believe that each school should have a 101 required course for all students related to racial injustice or racism, the history of racism. And, you know, you can read books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Rico mentioned Robert DiAngelo's White Fragility, The Souls of Black Folk, James Baldwin. There's plenty of books that you can really refer to as part of a curriculum that structurally changes the way, to Dr. Berry's point, how students are taught and how they view this thing called racism. It's not enough for, and I had a conversation with a client as a municipality, and their police department doesn't believe that they're racist. We don't have any racism in our police department. And they wanted me to get police to talk to them to in their language to convince them that there is systemic racism. Even for those who claim that they're not racist, and God bless them, I'm racist, and I'll admit that. However, they can't deny that they don't benefit from racism, or the white privilege that they enjoy is protected and preserved by racism. So when whites tell me that they're not racist, I still want to challenge them to help fight racism by challenging their peers, their colleagues, to be more like them, since they're not racist. But obviously, we're talking about institutional problems that have been around for decades. Blacks didn't invent racism. Race is a social construct. Racism preserves that social construct and stratosphere of inequality. And so this is different because people are at a tipping point, and the social media, as you know, explodes virally, instantly. Even the cameras within the Wendy's, right, or all these buildings that record everything. We can't escape the front seat view of murders and the injustices that are behind it. So I think that's how it's going to be different. And I will say this, it all has capitalism at its foundation. Capitalism drives disparities and disparate treatment. It's converse, because if you included more people, you would make more money. But I think there's a self-preservation philosophy behind the principles of capitalism. And I think that it will be different because people don't want to be on the wrong side of this historical phenomenon. And they're going to shave around the edges as much as they can in terms of taking action without destroying their underlying capitalistic priorities. I think some things will get done, but I don't know that the right things will get done. And that's just my opinion.
Thank you, Steve. Dr. Berry, how will this be different?
I'm going to say from the perspective of history, like I said, old teacher, recovering U.S. history and American government teacher, everything that we've seen in the past has been a movement. It has started at a point and it has stopped once we received some form of concession. But the U.S. government has never honored their word. They didn't. Not only did they not honor it to Black folks during the Civil Rights Movement, they didn't honor their word in treaties that were made with Native Americans when they stole their land and killed off their people and their cultures. They didn't honor the treaties made with Mexican Americans when they took or stole land that we now know as Texas. And one of the main things in that treaty was to maintain Spanish as a language of the land. And yet in most states in this country, Spanish is not taught, certainly not taught as a language of the land, but often not even taught to, or for children who come to school with that as their heritage language. They're not allowed to use it. As Black people, we've had a bit of a misguided trust, and some of us still have that government's going to keep their word. But now you have something different, and Steve just talked about social media. It wasn't around in the 60s, so you had a movement, right? We went from Jim Crow to having civil rights legislation, and we stopped. But now you see a revolution that's backed by real-time streaming images. They're on our phones, they're on our TVs, we cannot escape it. So people are literally dropping what they're doing, walking out and joining protests. And it's not just the 13% of Americans who are Black. Think about these numbers. 7% of Americans are multiracial. That takes us to 20%. 18% of Americans are Latino. So now you've got 38, almost 40%. And then add to that the massive number of white allies who have friends who've grown up with people of color, who see these people who are being attacked as their friends, people close to them. Those are the people willing to step in front of rubber bullets and take the pepper spray in order to protect their friends. And I'm going to use a word I probably wouldn't normally use in an educational setting. When white folks start catching hell, like their Black friends have been catching, they start to understand what it is we're going through. And because white people have power, they have social power, they have the political power, they have the economic power. When power makes concession, it's because of a demand. And when the people who hold power start making demands against government, our voices are much stronger together. I think that is probably what's going to force change. And one last thing, trying to talk fast, I stay in my 2 minutes. We have a horrible economy. We have unemployment that's at the rate of the Great Depression, right? We have a pandemic. It is literally a perfect storm of sorts. You have people who have time and they're ticked off. So they are going to, they're fed up with the old white power structure. We haven't seen this in this country. We think the largest protests we had before were about America's involvement in Vietnam. It wasn't anything near what we're seeing now. And that's why I think what we're seeing will be a revolution, a bit of an uprising, not just a little bit of a movement, and we're going to take a few concessions. Because if that were the case, this would have shut down a long time ago.
So, Daniel, I'm coming to you, and here it is. So a lot of times this conversation is tough to have for people who don't look like me, all right? And so, you know, and I'll just say this, in the Black community, we can talk about this all day long. But where the struggle seems to happen is when this conversation branches outside of that, sometimes there's offense taken by the conversation. There is, when you try to talk very transparently about an experience that might be different, offense is taken, and the terms that are often used is, well, I wasn't here for slavery, or I wasn't here for Jim Crow. I did not segregate you. Help us to understand, Daniel, how to have these conversations without having the offense there, that allows our allies to continue to be our allies. And I'm gonna make this quick statement before you answer, because once again, what we're seeing today is not a Black problem. It is a societal issue. Each of us is impacted by what we're seeing today. But how do we create an environment to allow this conversation to be had, that we all grow from it, versus walking away being offended by the conversation? Loaded question, big man.
Yeah, no, thanks for throwing me the softball. I appreciate that one. So I think it's a both and for me. On the one hand, we shouldn't be so afraid to offend people. There is a lot in our world that is tragic and destructive and traumatizing, and we should be offended by that. Whether or not I realize I'm participating in that, or engaging with it, or maybe just benefiting from it, I should be offended by oppression, by racism, by sexism. And so I always want to be careful about constructing the conversation too hard down the course of, we want to make sure no one ever gets offended. we want to be offended by things that are offensive. On the other hand, I think it is really important, as we think about building allyship across leadership platforms, that we create space where people feel invited in to participate in the conversation, even when they don't feel like they've got all the tools in their toolbox to fully engage yet. So maybe they're trepidatious or fearful that they're going to say the wrong thing. How do I help create a space where we can have a conversation about race and racism and equity and inclusion in this company or this school or whatever it is? How do I create that space where they feel like earnestness is going to be heard? If I'm earnest in asking the question, no one's going to point their finger at me and accuse me. So what I always try to set the stage for is earnestness is a great mitigator, right? You can say the wrong thing or ask the question the wrong way. And if you're asking it with the intent to learn, if it's a real question, not a stand-in for a gotcha moment, not a backhanded way to prove your own point. If it's a real question, I've had the privilege of being in lots of conversations with lots of people from lots of different perspectives. I've never once had an earnest question from me to someone else go unanswered, even when I know I haven't asked it the right way. Earnestness goes a long way. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping people understand how to ask better questions, how to reframe or detoxify or de-weaponize some of the language around bias and privilege and diversity, so that we can create a little bit more of a shared vocabulary platform, so that the earnestness in our questions gets understood better. And I do all that knowing, I think part of that is my privilege as a straight white guy to create space. Unfortunately, the vehicle matters. And so people are able to hear some of that from me in a different way. And so I say those things knowing, I think this is part of the lane I'm in this work as a white male. Part of it is trying to invite other white people of power into the conversation in ways that feel productive to them, where they know they can engage and learn and grow without all the tools in their toolbox right away. And then often trying to pass some of those relationships on to people, like some of the other consultants on this call, who have, decades of experience in strategy and systems or curriculum design. I'm a really good threshold. I help people get into the conversation, partly because I look like them, and research tells me they trust me more, unfortunately. But that's the reality. And part of it is just how we use the language and how we communicate to people, how we coach question asking, how we respond, and sometimes how we push back and help people understand what's just not okay. So that was, I don't know, a little all over the place maybe, but.
No. That was good. And I want to hear from Rico, then I want to go over to Steve. But I'm watching the clock, guys. So Go ahead. Rico and
Yeah,
Steve.
I think another piece is we don't let individuals off the hook, right? So oftentimes when we start calling someone an ist, right, whether that's racist or sexist or any of those ist, we're even though we are well intended, we're actually letting them off the hook, right? Because if I'm called a racist or I'm called a sexist, I can easily say no, I'm not, and the conversation ends there. What we need to be focusing on, if we want to have these conversations, are focusing on the behaviors or the data that support those actions, right? So if there's if something racist happens and you talk about the behavior and the action, then that nets a conversation in a way that it doesn't if you directly point the finger at a person and you allow them to be dismissive. So if you want to engage in these conversations, I think it's very important that you focus on the actions or the behaviors and also the outcomes. If you're looking at a district and say, okay, you can't go into a superintendent or to someone of leadership and say, hey, you're a racist, but you can say, hey, the numbers suggest these issues, and then why is that? And then that conversation can be had in a way that it can't be otherwise.
Steve.
Thanks. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Daniel Jude said. And in some conversations I've had recently, white friends of mine have really called in high numbers, just seeing how I'm doing. And what they lead is, I just don't know what to say. And so I want to impart the message that whites who want to reach out to Blacks and support them don't need the right words. They need the right emotions. And part of that is understanding that seeing George Floyd have his life asphyxiated from him on the street should prick a human emotion of outrage, regardless of, and Candace Owens comes to mind, regardless of if he's had a criminal background, that poor misguided girl, or if he is just a bad person. No human being deserves to die like that. And so I think that when our white friends reach out, it's to encourage them to be transparent and have humility. Another point that Daniel made, but listening. My mother told me that you never learn anything when you're talking. So I think that whites who want to be allies need to listen and learn and see how they can collaborate with those who they learn from to address the systemic and institutional and individual racist problems.
Thanks, Steve. So I have a question, Mark, and this is where I really kind of want to get down to. In about 2 months, we're going to have lots of children coming back somehow, some way to the schoolhouse, right? The fall school is going to happen. Universities are going to go back. Public schools are probably going to go back in some form. What do we tell our educational leaders, which are board members and superintendents and principals and teachers, how to prepare? Because we know, and I know as a building principal, kids bring all of this into the building, right? They're angry, they have strong emotions, they have families at home they're listening to what's going on at home, they have friends that they've seen things going on. You put on top of that a pandemic, and I mean, there's just a lot of stress right now. And so is there anything that our panelists could advise as we are getting ready to open schools in the fall, however that looks, that we can make sure that we're ready to receive our kids?
Let's start with Dale Johnson on that.
So the first thing that comes to my mind is creating an opportunity for the students to voice their opinions. And even if that's the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes of a classroom, getting inside the heads of some of these students. Hey, where are you at? How are you feeling? How are you processing this? And kind of going from there. And then some beauty can come from that because, if you will, like support groups, affiliate groups can come from that, affinity groups with which to kind of, embrace and kind of address certain things as they see. Then everybody becomes a part of the solution. Nobody's being talked at, nobody's being left out. Voices are being heard, feelings are being validated, and we can move forward in a positive manner. I don't think you have to address that. There's no way you can start the school year without having those types of talks, those types of conversations, and getting the pulse of the students.
Do you think that our educators and our teachers can do that? That would be my concern. If I had 50 staff members that were welcoming 2,000 students in, and I said, hey, give them 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of class, I'm gonna tell you right now, I would have had teachers come down to my office and say, I can't do this. I'm not equipped to do this. I'd have others that think they're experts and blow up the classroom. So how do we prepare the adults who we are going to be asking to be welcoming these kids in? What can we do to make sure that our adults are ready?
I think one of the things is just educate the teachers that it doesn't necessarily have to be a wrong or right discussion, right? It's about taking action. So looking at having them source some type of media, whether that's an excerpt from a book, an article, or a YouTube video, and putting that out as an assignment, and then letting their students react to it in whatever age appropriate way is a great strategy to bring that into the forefront. I think one of the issues is that teachers sometimes shy away because they feel they don't have all the answers, and so they don't do nothing at all. So I think that's a great strategy. I see Mitra has her hand up as well, so I'll give the floor to her.
Go ahead, Dr.
I just
Garrett.
want to say, as teachers, we probably don't know how to do it, but there's always got to be a tool, right? We've got to have some sort of leveler. So there's a book called The World Needs More Purple People. It's a children's book. I actually bought it to read to my 8-year-old great nieces to give them a little bit more understanding about what's going on. And the whole idea is that it's encouraging children to ask questions until they get valid answers and to speak up for people who don't have a voice. And we can't expect children to do that. We can't expect children to lead those conversations. We have to teach our learners to have those conversations, and we have to teach them the tool skills to have those conversations. And maybe along the way, some of the adults in the system will pick up some of those skills as well.
Thank you. Daniel Jude, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I see Patrick asking, can it be, part of back to school professional development? Yes, I think there's a place for getting some support in maybe designing a back to school activity that allows students to decompress and debrief from some of this. I think that's a perfectly appropriate way to think about a solution or designing a solution. Part of my response, I guess, is, you've got to expect what is likely. And I think it doesn't exist, it won't perfectly track maybe on color lines, but I think we should expect, based on the social media saturation of these tragedies, that our students of color come back into our classrooms traumatized and experiencing and displaying symptoms of trauma. And there is primary trauma, secondary trauma, and vicarious trauma. And we'll have students in classrooms experiencing one or more of those. And the symptoms of that can look really surprising, right? And so doing some pre-thinking, and maybe that's a part of the professional development as well, thinking about trauma. The flip side of that coin, and again, this isn't always true and it won't necessarily track always on color lines, but I am really concerned about the access that young people have to watching murder play out on social media. That is traumatizing to the brain in a different way. If we're not internalizing it as a part of my community, it's the same thing as a friend of mine said on social media today. I can learn a new dance on TikTok and then flip channels and watch a black man get killed. And it becomes part of my stream of entertainment. And I wrote about this in 2016, and it's still happening. And so I think we can expect some of our white students or students who haven't gotten to engage in productive conversations about race and what's going on to come in extra desensitized to this. And so I think the likelihood or the possibilities that we have a real culture clash at the beginning of school, because we've got over sensitivity and under sensitivity to what's happening based on the way sort of the saturation in social media has affected different people's brains based on their sort of position within this framework.
Great.
So I'm going to ask this, and I know we're getting up against the clock. So panelists, I need a 30-second response to this. So as we said, we're solutions driven, and in connection to our wellness challenge that we'll have next week, I want you to give each of our participants today just one strategy that they can implement in this next week around race relations. give me one strategy that our participants today can implement in regards to their daily lives to have these courageous conversations. Just give one strategy, Dale Johnson, really quick. I'm giving everybody.
Mark,
Go ahead.
while they're thinking, because we've kind of asked them to find the golden ticket, the silver bullet, as you're trying to figure that out, we are going to our members, I'm going to tell them the challenge up front so they can really pay attention to what everybody's saying, is we're going to ask that you implement one of the strategies that's about to be shared with you. And then next week at our town hall, we'll have an opportunity to share out how that experience was. So as you're listening, do know we're going to ask you to grab one of these strategies and actually live it, not just talk about it, not just, actually get on the ride and ride it. Okay, Mark.
All right, Dale Johnson.
So 2 things immediately come to my mind. Number one, there's a video called The Unequitable Race. It only is about a 3-minute video. You can Google it. Talks about race disparages. It's a great video to watch. That, and also along with the 13th. I would suggest watching that and watching that with other white friends to educate them on that process. And I guarantee you'll come away from that conversation with much more information and ready for some conversation.
Great. Hey, Angela, if our team can capture what these strategies are and throw them in the chat box, that would be great. Okay, go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Berry.
Oh, you just had to come to me second. Well, Dale took one of mine. So the second one to really start to get an understanding is 1619. If you haven't listened to that podcast, 1619. And the second, I'll go back to what I said before. Get a review of your social sciences framework. Insist on teaching true and complete story of our country. If you have no idea where to start, I will give you a framework model. So you can just email me and we'll get that.
Rico.
Yeah, I just put something in the chat. There's an article by USA Today, 100 ways you can take action against racism right now. So read that article, select a couple strategies from there. Also, suggest having that authentic conversation with your board and asking yourself this question right here: why now? Right? Why now? These are things that have been going on for a long time, and obviously there's a lot of attention going towards it right now. So why now? What is different now? And if it's just because this is the conversation that the country's having, I think you need to dig deeper if you're really going to impart change, because the conversation will change quickly. So it has to be more than just because this is the right thing to do right now, or the popular thing to do right now.
Thank you. Steve Francis.
Yeah, thanks. A strategy I have, as Kathy framed it, in the next couple of weeks, I guess before the next school year starts, would be to do an organizational assessment of your school. By that, I mean, I was talking to that group of Dublin Black parents last night, and the principal of the high school was facilitating, and he had 2 of his staff there. And he said, honestly, I couldn't bring my whole staff to this meeting because they really wouldn't understand what to say, or they would have different positions or views about our conversation. And so understanding that there's a different viewpoint of all your teachers and administrators in your buildings, you need to assess where they stand, and you need to zero base them on their racial IQ to see what their issues are. And I mean, again, it's the first step of the 12-step program to admit that there's a problem. So do a zero-based analysis, baseline, and make sure that you equip them with whatever tools you need to address any deficiencies they have or any learning curves that they need. Then, first day of school, I would ask those 4 questions. Have each teacher in each classroom listen to the students, tell them how they are doing, what do they need, what's their hope for the future, and what do they think meaningful change looks like regarding racial justice. And they need to listen and learn, and then they need to regurgitate that learning to the students in a general assembly about what they've learned and the actions they're going to take.
Thank you, Steve. Daniel Jude.
Yes, thanks, Mark. The Smithsonian released a really great narrative history of the U.S., 158 things to learn about racism. It's really accessible and approachable if you're looking for something to read, and then there are 158 links out of that article. But in terms of action items for school leadership across the next month or so as you prepare, I think I'd do two things. I would ask teachers, what do you need? Where do you feel ill or under-equipped? What do you need? And ask parents, what do you want? As you send your kids back into this space, what is it that you want for them? And probably you'll have a lot of alignment, and you'll likely get some disparity in those answers. And those are going to point to where you need to get started in your work.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Quickly, Kathy, I want to give it over to you in a moment, but I want to thank each of our panelists tonight for being here. Thank you to each of you for your expertise, for your insight, for your honesty about how we can approach this subject and move forward. Kathy, you wanted to talk more about 21-Day Challenge.
So I'm going to leave that for Rick Lewis to close on. I do want to do a shout out that our board president, our OSBA president, Lee Schreiner, is on our call. So big shout out to him. We have had some requests, Mark, to continue to have this conversation. That 60 minutes, like Rico pointed out, is just not enough time to really go deep in some of these conversations. So you and I will work on making sure that we're back in. And I think just tonight was great. The resources our experts shared. I mean, my gosh, that to me was outstanding. So
definitely,
we will continue to do this work for sure moving forward. And remember, challenge is pick one of those strategies and make sure you're willing to talk about it next week. I think we can learn a lot from each other and our journey on that. Mark, if you don't have anything else to say, I'm going to give it to Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm getting some feedback here. I hope I'm coming through okay. Just a real quick plug for something that the OSBA staff is going through. Gwen Salmon and our diversity and inclusion team brought this to us just in the last week. It's a program by the Michigan League for Public Policy, and it takes you through a 3-week model that's adapted to highlight racial inequity and some of the priorities in Michigan. We're just stealing it right from them. It only takes a couple moments a day. I'll confess I'm only 2 days into it myself, but I'm finding it to be a neat program, easy to understand. It makes it understandable so you can become both conversant to keep up with others in the conversation and perhaps lead some conversations yourself by the end of the period. So whether it's for you, your family, your team, or your district, I encourage you to take a look at it and see if it fits for you. And I am putting up a link right now to that particular site. And I believe Angela had already posted a link in the beginning of the conversation to all of our resources. So I know we're running short on time, Kathy. I'll end it there and turn it to Lee for closing, unless there's anything else.
I'm not sure if we hooked Lee in properly this time. So.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can.
All right. Rick, I appreciate being asked and given the honor once again to close this another timely informational town hall on this Wednesday. A special appreciation, you've heard it, to today's panel of experts all. Thank you. As this year's OSBA president, I want and I need to say thank you to each of you here today for taking the time out of your busy schedule in these very unique times that we live in. The difference, and to be part of the solution, as I heard a number of panelists talk about tonight. And I just wanted to, my grandmother also said, 2 ears, 1 mouth. You should be listening twice as much as you talk. So I appreciate her in that too. And for all that each of you do every day with all of our students in Ohio Public Schools, thank you. Be safe.
Thank
Kathy.
you, Lee. Thank you very much. And as
Thank
we
you all.
close, please make sure our consultants are available to you. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to, they put their information in that chat box. Use your resources. We cannot do this alone, Mark. We've got to bring in help to make sure that we're doing this.
And listen, you all have been made better just by being part of this conversation. So if this is the first step or one of many,
Right.
just continue on the journey and we'll all be better for it.